Oscast.
Welcome to STRATEGIKON.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Today we're joined from the UK by Rhoderick Miller. Rhoderick is an old friend of David and mine, and we'd spent many an hour unpacking geopolitics at the University of Adelaide staff club over a lazy bottle of red or two. They were good times, but they were also times when the world was at peace and we could all be a little bit more objective about international relations and security. A warning: this conversation about Ukraine could get a little hairy, but it is designed to challenge the listener, hopefully, with a view of making everyone a little bit more rounded in their perceptions of this awful war. Rod, welcome to STRATEGIKON.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Okay, so Rod, here we have this incredibly ridiculous war. And I mean, I will say, the rookie mistakes that the Russian military have made up to now make soldiers, or normally would make soldiers, cringe slightly. There wasn't a matter of sending in the Spetsnaz doing an assassination attempt on Zelensky. That there was, back in the day when I was a kid growing up during the Cold War, there were all these wonderful stories about Soviet special forces having penetrated every level of Western government with Spetsnaz ready to go and take out, Western leaders in decapitation strikes all over the place. And I suppose, having grown up on those stories, one tended to overestimate or maybe not think that the Russian army was in such a parlous state. What do you think was wrong with the way that Putin has planned this war?
I don't think Putin's done anything wrong with this war. In fact, I think almost everything you've said is fantastical nonsense, basically. Let me preface, I don't think that you are just talking off your head. I think the information we are getting is constructing a narrative which most of us are expected to absorb and come out with your endpoint. But I think it's fantastical twaddle. Let me explain. We know how the Russians fight wars. We know how they fight land wars. And after the second part of the Chechen wars, in inverted commas, and after what happened in Syria, we know how they fight counterinsurgency wars. We are seeing a very small part of a very large war and being asked to believe a whole load of twaddle. My guess is that, we know the Ukrainian Navy was obliterated within 25 minutes of the war. We know the Air Forces probably lasted 2 to 3 days, maybe 4 at a stretch. I think it's reasonable to suspect that most of the downings of Russian aircraft had been done by, let's say, what's the old term they used to use? Military advisors, as opposed to Ukrainian soldiers themselves. And the brutal reality is something like 60 to 80% of the Ukrainian forces are in one of two cauldrons, a close one next to Donetsk, where they're going to get wiped out, and a secondary one between Donetsk and Kiev, where they'll get encircled. I think, put brutally, the Russians can take casualties no matter what. They're not cared about casualties. But we're talking about the surrender or destruction or exile, and that last one needs to be kept in mind, because that's their lesson that they learned from Syria, or they may have learned it earlier, but they applied it in Syria. You can see it in Syria. We're talking about 60 to 70% of the Ukrainian forces ceasing to exist at all in the next week, maybe two.
Right. So
let me start off. What we're seeing on our TV channels were special forces and conscripts sent as a blocking wave to basically isolate central cities from the fighting and the dying which is happening in the east. And to keep supply lines blocked, clogged up, we're seeing a large amount of Russian forces outside Kiev halted. Now, people say, oh, this is logistic twaddle. This is a threat. It's an encirclement. So we're going to wait here, and we're going to, because we do this in the West. We kind of have negotiations. We're going to stop negotiating. We're going to fight. We're going to stop fighting and negotiate. The Russians don't do that. They're doing the two at the same time. They use the negotiations, threats to counteract each other. I think most of the commentary we have seen from British, American, Western sources is either really delusional people or histrionics of people losing.
You know, that would also include a lot of former military people who have provided commentary.
Yes, that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because, I mean, I understand that in every war there is a degree of propaganda, right? But we're living in a post-World War II media environment where with, you know, the guy with the camera basically on his phone is filming things in real time. These things are very difficult to fake. It's not that it can't be faked, it's just very difficult to fake. So when we're seeing columns of Russian forces stuck on a road going nowhere, this is part of this is
on a road.
It's not stopped on the road. So it's actually moving, but we're just not seeing it. Is that right?
We see it stopped. We don't see it stuck. That's what we're being told to miss.
Right.
Them stopping doesn't mean they're stuck. Them stopping means they're waiting.
I see. Now, at this point, I'm going to bring David in because I'm sure he has a few things to say about that.
Oh,
David?
yeah, go for it.
Well, again, the best trick of that would be to be able to get some satellite imagery of where the railhead ends and the transition from the railhead to going on vehicles. Seeing within Russia, they're moving everything by rail. So if we see that that's all still busy and everything is still being offloaded and everything's going on to trucks, then that's exactly what Rhoderick's describing. Is this really just is about how much stuff they're moving, and they're moving so much stuff in. Now, if that's possible, that's a radical improvement and transition to Russia's historical ability to move stuff anyway other than rail. In terms of what are they doing militarily? Well, they're doing what they've always done. They started with hybrid because it's the new toy, and then they'll move on to destroying cities because that's what they're good at. And why would you change?
I don't think they're going to destroy cities. I should make this clear. They want to own the cities. They don't want to destroy them. And they also saw the debacles of Iraq and Afghanistan. They want to own cities at the end of this. Not all of them, only some of them, really important ones. Aleppo, I think Kiev as well. They don't want rubble.
Yeah, but
they may not want the population.
The only way they're going to break the Ukrainians and get them to go home to their villages and make them manageable is to take a few cities out. It's a question of which ones.
Yeah, well, there's lots of caveats there because what do we mean by Ukrainians? And here's the thing. The population of Ukraine is guesstimated sometimes to be about 70% Ukrainian, but a lot of those are culturally Russian, even if they're not ethnically Russian. About half the population is first language linguistically Russian. And what do we mean by, I mean, most of Western Russia, Western Ukraine are what we would have called Galicians, 150 years ago. They're not a Slavic population. They're Hungarians and Poles and Lithuanians and Romanians. My guess is we will end up with I'm going to borrow from another part of the world, a two-state solution. We'll end up with a Galician republic that might end up with the name Ukraine, and Novorussia, a new Russia.
It's interesting that you say that now, because when we recorded a month ago, that's basically the point I ended up, that the most likely end at that point was, half of what was Ukraine joining Russia and the other half becoming a new, smaller Ukraine of the people that don't want to be part of Russia. This is the easiest possible way to get to that point.
I think this has always been an inevitability. And Putin has explicitly said he considers Western Ukraine Polish and Hungarian, and he doesn't want it. So, and from his perspective, can you imagine trying to dominate that population who don't think they're Russian, who've got a lot of what we're not allowed to say, neo-Nazis in it? I mean, we're talking about maybe a fifth of the Ukrainian army would easily be classified as neo-Nazis. Do you want to govern those people, or do you want to shove them off to Liev?
I'm not so convinced about those numbers, Roderick.
No.
I will say I think that every country has its problem with an extreme political fringe, and taking a kernel of truth and extending it over an entire population is also a little rich. But
no, I'm not talking about the entire population. I'm talking about the military.
Yeah, but Putin is he wants a denazification policy. I don't think it's going to be about purging the Ukrainian military of these elements, or even the Ukrainian government. I think that really it can go one step further, incorporating a larger segment of a traumatized population.
Yeah, it's anyone who basically wants to have a different identity to the one they've been given. Now, to go back to geographical stuff, if essentially they're going to take everything that is quote unquote Russian in Ukraine and give it the offer of being permanently part of Russia, do you think they'll push down into Moldova and Transnistria and essentially link up everyone who wants the same thing?
Well, I think they'll take, well, no, we know they're going to take Odessa. It'll be next week. In the next 2 or 3 days, they will take Odessa, and the Odessa population will welcome them, this is one of the things. Why are we not seeing any footage from the cities that we know they're fighting in? Because they're probably going to show you the civilians being on the Russian side, and they're probably going to see a lot of Ukrainian forces being knocked back. The fact that you've never seen anything come out of Mariupol, or well, certainly we haven't here. I think that the blank space in the reportage is telling you where the Russians are winning. I think they'll take Odessa, and they'll use Odessa to keep Transnistria.
May I ask a question, Roderick? And it is, considering what you're saying, I mean, there's something that I, from a geographic perspective, can't quite understand. I mean, I get the fact that before the war started, we were all speculating that, yes, the east of Ukraine is very much pro-Russian, whatever that sort of demographic was all about. But why then has it taken so long for the Russians to have actually stomped on Kharkiv, which is just over the border of Russia? And you would imagine that a lot of people in that area, if we were to assume that they were all pro-Russian, are now running for their lives because there's an active war going on, and a lot of the artillery hitting that city is not necessarily Ukrainian, but Russian.
To be honest, I don't know. Nobody knows, apart from Russian high command, and they're not sharing it with us, are they? Mm-hmm. My guesstimation would be you're seeing something like Aleppo. My guesstimation is you're seeing surround, civilian populations allowed to get out, those soldiers who want to evacuate either to Kiev or Lviv or wherever are allowed to go, and then the hardcore ones are going to have their last stand against the Russians. I would imagine we're going to see something equally nasty in Odessa, and I imagine what's happened in Mariupol has been really nasty. It's not that the Russians are failing, it's that the Ukrainian fanatics are fighting to the last man. And the Russians, what they did in Syria is quite clear. Encircle, negotiate to get anybody who wanted to get out, got gone, and then squish what's left. And this is also, we're working with these ridiculous timetables. I mean, think how long it took the Americans to get to Saddam's palaces. I mean, it took, memory, 28 days?
No.
And the Americans were fighting in desert. They weren't fighting in Eastern Europe.
It was less than a week.
Yeah, I believe that that's the case. And also the other significant difference too is that the Americans were fighting from half a world away, having to support this major operation, whereas the Russians are having
with no world opposition,
are having to fight right next door. So yeah, absolutely. With no real organized opposition, that is true. But the fact remains, you're fighting in a country that you should have, well, if not near perfect intelligence on, you should have enough intelligence which would have allowed the Russians to have made far greater headway than they have up to now. This, I think, is something that is perplexing a lot of people who are observing this. Why is it taking the Russians as long? Now, I don't buy the argument that the Russians are necessarily trying to do their humanitarian duty. I mean, we'll know that for certain once the war is done.
Against everything they've learned from fighting wars.
Well, that's right. And I mean, they didn't do it in Aleppo. They didn't do it in Grozny. Why would they do it in?
But it would also be massively against their interests. They want to hold this population.
But they have gone about it the wrong way, though, haven't they? Haven't they already
I don't
stop a lot of people?
Let's talk about evidence. Right. I haven't seen evidence of actual Russian crimes. All I have seen is a huge amount of Ukrainian claims that fall apart within 48 hours. Right. Where is evidence of this? We have the Ghost of Kiev, which was a video game character.
Yeah.
You know, we have lots of burnt out vehicles that happen to be the same kinds of vehicles that the Ukrainians are going to have, as well as the Russian conscripts. They're not the type of vehicles that the Russian regulars are going to be having. Do we know these Russian tanks? Do we know they're Ukrainian vehicles? I mean, also, people calling things tanks that aren't tanks, but that's a mild pernickety thing. My view is we are seeing everything through a very, very histrionic-driven lens from the media.
The thing with this is, with all the effort Russia has done to manipulate other people's media, why haven't they done a good job of presenting their version of the story? And this is actually a very interesting thing. I'm
going to ask a question. If the Russian disinformation campaign isn't that effective now, are we sure their previous attempts were actually them?
Yes. There's enough good books on it by enough good people to have no doubt of how effectively they've interfered in other people's worlds. That's been well documented.
I'm not up on the literature on that. Well, I have to admit,
it's my new world. So
I have deep-seated reservations.
They're excellent at manipulating dumb democracies that don't pay attention to other people want to hurt them. So why they're not doing brilliant at this media game is beyond me. You know, the fact that all these Russian troops, quote unquote, supposedly didn't have their mobile phones with them, that's all very sensible. But why wasn't the alternate Russian media really, really good? You know, we were all waiting for the false flag operations. Why didn't we get 20 of them?
Yeah, but also, how do I put this? The Americans saying there's going to be a false flag operation from the Americans, considering their history, that just in itself raises all sorts of flags.
Yeah, but it wasn't a question of the Americans saying, it was a question that anyone who's paid attention to how the Russians have learned to fight knows that's going to be the game. Unless they've decided to change the game suddenly. And why would they change the game when normally they have the winning formula? So it seems at the moment that they've got a good formula for rolling into the country. Kharkiv has been the surprise to them, perhaps, that it's been more of a mess than they assumed. Everything else is actually on a perfectly good timetable for the kind of war they like to fight. Their media strategy not being in place is very odd. But again, as long as they're on time with the thing of surround and destroy, it doesn't really matter. How far they go, you know, across Odessa, where they then go to Moldova, that's then very interesting to see. Is this just about Ukraine, or is this about blocking the gateways into, you know, Russian space, which a lot of people now assume it is? And if it's about Moldova, well, then we get closer to Romania. That's a totally different kettle of fish to Poland. And if that's really
my guess with the Moldova question is they're going to sit on the borders. They don't have to go in, they just have to be nearby to get what they want. I was always deeply skeptical about the extent to which we believed the Russian media campaigns existed I'm prepared to say that it's not an area of expertise. I think the absence of it at the moment is glaring. But also, let's look at, you have the British, the Americans, and the French all running campaigns effectively for the Ukrainians, and you have the Ukrainians. You can't pick up a newspaper in Britain without it telling you the Ukrainian perspective. These are the most powerful soft power players in the world, and they're all running the same lines, with very few exceptions. I mean, there's one American colonel, went on Fox and basically told them what I believe. I'd never heard of the guy, and he basically said everything that I had read from the maps, everything I'd read from the gaps in the commentary, and I'd gone looking to see. I mean, we knew this war was coming for 19 years, well, 18 and a half, and I'd sort of forgotten about it since university, and it was really intense going back and what have I missed? What's gone on in the intervening years? It's quite clear we are getting such a narrow slice of the story through our media that what we're missing screams to me Russia's winning.
Oh yeah, they're winning, no doubt. It's a question of what the long-term aim is and how many other targets are relevant. And again, that issue of have they got tons of equipment? Yes. Do they appear to have enough people now? Yes. But demographically, this needs to be relatively short and relatively bloodless to be sustainable.
We don't know the casualties.
Well, immaterial what the casualties are, you're dealing with an aged population where an awful lot of the young have left. This is not a good time to be fighting a war unless you can do it in a year, lock it down, and not have to garrison it forever. Yeah. That's too. Well,
my guess is there's not going to be garrisoning. My guess is you're going to get
the subdivision into 2 states and have a new border and make life easier because the people you've liberated, quote unquote, will be happy to be on the new border. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll be happy to be in charge as well.
Yeah, of essentially
in inverted commas, in charge of the new state. And we can disagree, but I think the record's quite clear. The Ukrainians have been particularly harsh in recent years on the ethnic and cultural and linguistically Russian population of the East.
Well, building up.
I think the term genocide is excessive.
Appropriate to fight this. They were dealing with rabid nationalism, and they've learned the lesson that if you're going to have to deal with rabid nationalism, the best way to confront it is to almost go to the same point. And they're really lucky they ended up with a president who actually looks, acceptable to the rest of the world. Otherwise, it would look like the psychos versus the psychos at the moment. Instead, but it looks better than that from a Western perspective.
Are you reading him as anyone in actual charge?
No, but my point is, he was a good figurehead for the for the comms.
What's the term that they use? He's a beard. And look, he's going to run away to Lviv, and then from Lviv to a government in exile in Washington somewhere, and he'll maybe end up with a Hollywood career, which is probably what he wants.
If the people behind the beard are very serious, he'll die in the next 10 days and become a martyr, and he'll be used for the justification to show you can't have the other half of Ukraine.
Yeah, but it depends on who's the beard. Who's the beard covering? Sorry. Yeah. Is he covering the neo-Nazis? Is he covering the permanent establishment in Washington and in London?
Well, more importantly, is he covering an identity in the western part of Ukraine that aligns very closely with Hungary and Poland of never again do we go under the boot, and we'll do almost anything to avoid it? It doesn't have to be neo-Nazi. It has to have learnt from the last 20 years of watching other people get destroyed.
And to be fair, I think the war itself is a much less interesting thing than that, which is going on around the war. And the way that the West is committing suicide. I mean,
the West is committing. Hang on. The West is committing suicide.
Yes.
Has it not been a matter of fact that up until the war, NATO has pretty much conducted itself like the Al Bundy's family on Married with Children, where They keep on squabbling. No one agrees. Everything is, you know, really craptacular to the max. There was no sense of unity. The Germans, well, of course, they denuded themselves of an armed force entirely, commensurate to the size of its economy. All of that, right? And then the big scary bear raises its head, and all of a sudden, all of those things that concern people looking at NATO for many, many years seem to have almost vanished. And it seems like NATO has a purpose again. And the purpose is quite simple, because, you know, NATO was founded to basically destroy the Russian bear under communism during the Cold War. And now they're going back to the old playbook. And it's a much easier playbook to operate off, as opposed to these extraterritorial expeditions into Iraq and Afghanistan, which no one really understood. It's much easier to understand a threat coming from the East because it's deeply ingrained within Western European culture. So now that we have this happening, I'm really curious to find out what your view on a potential tactical nuclear strike would be, because if, for instance, this becomes a protracted struggle, surely it can't be to Putin's advantage. And also,
no.
No. Let me finish.
There's a race.
Let me finish. No, Roderick, come on, let me finish. So if it's not going to be to Putin's advantage, because quite frankly, the West has now unplugged Russia from the international financial system, logic would dictate that at some point in this military campaign, they will not have the financial wherewithal to prosecute their war any further. So it leaves them in a very difficult position, because if then Putin can't prosecute the war to his end objectives, the people around Putin must think, especially those people who have profited from Putin's regime up to now, maybe this guy isn't all that. Maybe this guy is going to destroy what's left of what we have, which wasn't much to begin with. Now you can answer.
Well, actually, why don't we jump back to Roderick's previous point, which was, why is the West suicided? Because you need to unpack that for people who don't understand what that concept means in the current situation.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. Move nuclear weapons off the table. They're there to, as a worst case scenario.
Okay, no, let's leave them on the table in one way, and that is that every staff officer since the late 1990s in Russia has been trained to use tactical nukes as part of planning. And they're the only people in the world who do that, other than the Indians and the Pakistanis.
Yeah, well, there's another element, that their command and control and their detection systems are atrocious, which makes them even more scary.
Yes.
And people think, oh, well, they're not up to date. No, that's a scary thing. That makes
the problem.
You have to pay more attention to them, because they could shoot by mistake as well. And they could shoot everything by mistake. So you need to play nice with them, because, I mean, the last time this happened, apparently about 12 years ago, it was only because Putin was really chummy with the American president of the time, which my brain goes, is it the early days of, yes, it's the early days of Obama. And he was playing nice, and Obama and Putin said, no, this is nonsense. Turn everything off. This is clearly not real. It's not something I'm really up to date on the details of. I've probably mangled it terribly, but you don't need to get there to know why Europe is committing terrible mistakes with this. The point is, our fuel prices are going up dramatically before this is happening. We're looking at 50% price rises before the Russians start squeezing, and the Russians can squeeze us very hard. And that's depression kind of squeezing. The Russians are going to have the first and second major producers of wheat and corn and maize. They have huge stranglehold on commodities, and all our shipping companies have just said, we're not going to move stuff to and from Russia. And the only ones who are saying, yes, we're going to carry on are the Chinese, which is nonsense, right? These people need to be fired, who are ever making these decisions. We've cut the Russians out of the economic system. The Russians have been tempted to leave the economic system for ages. They've been planning this for ages. They don't care.
Oh, right? I don't know about
They're
that.
going to have 2 months.
They're
going to have 2
An
months
army marches on its stomach, Roderick.
They're going to have
and also the
months
Russians are not an autarkic state. They have
They're
also
planned.
they have
Okay,
planned.
again, let me jump in between
I
you two
don't think
before
so.
you yell at each other.
Yeah.
Let's just look practically. Russia's going to have heaps of wheat, so they've got no problem with food. The problem they've got is having a population healthy enough, young enough to farm. That can be solved by a deal with China of letting them back into the east to do huge amounts of farming for them, which was starting to happen before COVID and was all a bit uncomfortable, will probably be more comfortable now. In terms of weapon systems, there is no evidence that manufacturing of anything they need can't continue. They have everything they need. Where they get the computer chips at the quality they need is a bit of a mystery, but they appear to have been able to maintain that. The West shutting them down might affect space and going to space, but that's about the only evidence. So if they just continue chugging at making artillery and rockets and basic armor, they can go for at least a few years without any trouble.
Yeah, and they're going to get everything they need for the top end stuff from the Chinese.
Yeah, well,
So,
again, this is the reason to help the Chinese make better stuff, because we've now wedded these two countries to each other at a level they weren't before. So let's now go back to food and energy for Europe. Russia will keep chugging along for years. It doesn't care about its own people, never has, never will. The system will keep
that's
running.
a bit brutal, but yeah.
To make these weapons, that's what they do. That's their only income stream. They live in separate cities. Those cities will keep functioning exactly as they've always functioned, because they're off the map and don't exist anyway. Now let's look at food and oil prices. So we can see in the last week that there's been more ground made on returning Iran to the normal world than in the last year. So there's a desperate move at the moment to try and bring Iranian oil back into the books. And interestingly, there appears to be all sorts of discussion in the last week about how quickly Venezuelan oil could be brought back into the world as well. So we can see.
And in the first case, it's the Russians negotiating it.
Oh, okay.
The Iran negotiations seem to have been entirely hijacked by the Russians.
See, that's interesting because, again, it looks like they've been pushed forward and things will happen. But yeah, what's going on behind it and who initiated it is bizarre. Venezuela is much the same. So if we go, okay, oil prices will probably double in the next 3 to 6 months. That's cataclysmic. Again, the whole thing of being back in a depression, absolutely. Now, the thing that the media keep getting wrong, because they keep talking about food, food's a problem that's already been grown. The bigger problem is you have just taken the biggest fertilizer producer in the world out of the mix. So even here in Australia, if we can't buy potash from Russia and Belarus, next year's yields here in Australia will drop by at least a third.
And we will let them back in, and they will charge us 3 times the price.
So we're screwed either way then, right?
Yeah.
Screwed either way.
Look,
We've made now a permanent enemy out of Russia.
Yeah, we should have given Ukraine back to the Russians 13 years ago. And every year that we've held on to it, we've built a bigger rock, bigger stick for our backs.
So can I want to ask you something, Rhoderick. So, John Mearsheimer has been doing the rounds on YouTube. And of course, he's an offensive realist, and he does say that, this was a terrible thing and a Western mistake. And basically, had we listened to Putin back in, whenever it was, 2008 in the Bucharest round, we could have sorted everything out then and there. And the question that always comes up in my mind, maybe you have the answer for it, but would Putin have been satisfied with a neutral Ukraine? Would they have been okay with a Finlandized or an Austrianized Ukraine on its borders? Or was it always going to end up being a struggle for Luhansk and Donetsk, and we would have had some sort of military stoush with the Russians at some point, whether for the whole of Ukraine or for a sliver of it, because there was that nagging element that we wouldn't move on and the Russians wouldn't move on?
Well, everything's happy until there's what the Russians consider a coup d'etat in 2014. Everything's happy until what we consider a color revolution, 2014. I think if everything pre-2014 had continued and we had said, no NATO, no nukes, he would have put up with the Nazis. The minute we had the revolution/coup, I think that's when we decided this is going to happen. And I'm going to add a point. I think that people knew full well that this was a war and they wanted to keep a war in their pocket. I think this was done on purpose by the Americans. And the only reason we're having the war now is because Biden's incompetent.
Well, it doesn't really favor Biden. I mean, this is more of a European war, irrespective of how
favours the
tangential.
Americans getting out of the world forever.
Well,
And when you look at the moment, they're on the verge of energy self-sufficiency by using shale oil. They are one of the biggest fertilizer producers in the world. They do mass monoculture, agriculture. Their capacity to de-link is at the highest level it's been literally for probably 50 years.
Yep.
So there's an irony in that. That it is the best time to do it. But again, let's take it out beyond Ukraine, because it's easy to just look at this as Ukraine. But if we just look at the transition in Russia of population who left in the 90s to the early 2000s, somewhere between 2 and 10 million people, because the Russians won't tell. A continuous stream after that. There is a degree in this where, with everything that happened in Ukraine, on top of demographically and economically what's happening in Russia, it's either do this now or it gets harder and harder and harder. So, things were moving to the point where something had to happen one way or the other. And the most intriguing question here to me is, okay, it's now started rolling. People are saying this is a legacy thing for Putin. How big does the legacy have to be? So this is why, to me, half of Ukraine made perfect sense a month ago. Half of Ukraine makes perfect sense still. But there was no need to mobilize in this way to this extent to get half of Ukraine. This seems a bigger, messier mobilization than was necessary to create a new reduced Ukraine and a new, enlarged extra part of Russia. And all right, some ways, Belarus wanted to be supported, to still be part of the evil empire, to live in the world of dictators and nastiness. They got their prize. This is complicated economic stuff for them, in as much as, yes, they're going to be able to charge a lot more for wheat and fertilizer in future. And people still have to buy it because there's no other producer in the world.
My guesstimation is that, so for a while now, I've been looking at the press, and I thought the Americans were egging on the Russians for a war. I think the unbelievably stupid people inside the White House, I think they wanted a small war. I think they wanted a small war, and they wanted it in December or January, and Putin stalled and stalled and stalled until he could get to a position where you give them a big war. You ask for something, you're going to get double. And that's my reading of it. I could be completely talking off my head.
I'll spin it sideways. My version is, it was expected there would be a small war, and everyone was at peace with a small war, would have just done the appropriate amount of outrage. And this is why in that first couple of days, the Europeans sort of start going, oh, tut tut, and then sound a bit like, oh crap, what just happened? Because I think on everyone's desk had been the memo of the small war. The small war was meant to happen. The small war was meant to divide the country in two. The small war was going to be very, ugly. There would be an awful lot of hand wringing, but then it would be, oh, what could we do? He's got nuclear weapons. But it was only a small war after all. Whereas,
and then he gave them a big war.
Small to big is why everyone's having the freak out.
Yes.
And that leads us to the next logical point, and that is, are we in the West technically at war with Russia? Because we are supplying Russia's enemy on the ground in Ukraine. We are fighting this war by proxy.
Yeah, but this has been the norm since the end of World War II. We're just back into uglier, more dangerous proxy wars that can explode in our face, worse than they could.
Yeah, I'm going to go a step further. I don't think there's Ukrainians firing the javelins.
Well, I mean,
no, I don't,
because this is not stuff you can pick up and play.
No, but I don't care if it's Ukrainians or not. That's really irrelevant, because it's been sold so well. Every ex-SOCOM dude who had a shit war in Afghanistan and Iraq might see that this is the war they'd preferred to fight.
That's right.
Oh yeah.
So the Kool-Aid has been going around, thick and fast, on all sides. Of let's buy into our delusion of grandeur and our delusion that our thing is worth dying and killing for.
And so, therefore, we've got 16,000 foreign volunteers who have signed up to go into Ukraine and give the Ukrainian army whatever support they require. We have private military companies that are going in as well.
I'm thinking deniable.
Yeah,
but
deniable.
in
Well,
uniform
private military
guys.
companies are deniable. You can.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, my suspicion, and it is only a suspicion, and it can only ever be a suspicion until Putin puts them up on trial in Moscow, is that we're talking about regular, or granted special regulars from at least Britain and America, and probably France as well, possibly Germany.
Let's look back to Yemen in the 60s, where suddenly a squadron of the SAS fell off the books for 2 years.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, but
They went on holiday, in inverted commas.
Yeah, they literally did. They went to Yemen.
But what matters is, if they are in the Donbass cauldron and they don't die and they don't get out, they're going to go to Siberia. And then they're going to be put on trial on camera in front of the Chinese, in front of the Indians.
Yeah,
when we have to explain 16,000 of our guys in their jails, that's going to be problematic, to use the term that kids use these days.
Yeah, but let's go back to the idea of the small war versus the big war. My feeling is that for the sake of making sure the small war ran as it was meant to run, most of the people, our Western little green men, what's a polite word for Western little green men? We just call them Western little green men.
Yeah.
Our Western little green men were always meant to secure the borders of what was going to become Western Ukraine. So I don't think most of these guys are that deep. And probably as it's got messy like it is now, this is part of the reason why the Ukrainians will start losing even faster. Because the advanced support was not for fighting for the country as a whole. The advanced support was fighting the small war appropriately to make sure the border was put where it was meant to be.
So at what point then do we assume that the small war will start off, where Western forces, proxy or otherwise?
No, now that the West basically thought it was so clever as usual that all the signaling has been small war for a decade, like Rhoderick was saying. And so the West prepared for a small war, and it genuinely thought the world would run as it thinks because we're idiots. And because
we'd also been fighting a small war for 8 years.
Yeah.
So, people will forget this. Ukraine and Donetsk have been fighting for 8 years, and overwhelmingly the civilian casualties have been amongst ethnic Russians.
Yep.
And we don't know the details, but I get the impression real serious atrocities.
All right, so let's put it to that Ukraine's future is as a divided state. Where does Kiev sit in this divided state?
Well, it was, but again, this is what's changed by Putin going, well, if I can get away with the small war, and this is the only thing Rhoderick and I will end up agreeing on, is everyone thought there was going to be a small war, and Putin went, well, if all they're preparing for is a small war, why not do the big war?
Yeah.
So basically, we're looking at a total Russian occupation of Ukraine, where we know because of the demographic issues that the Russian military will be facing now and into the next 10 years, they're going to find it harder and harder to administer without a good submissive portion of the Ukrainian population to administer Ukraine on behalf of the Russians with. So where are you going to get that from?
I think it will depend on how many millions of people leave as refugees, how much the slither state known as West Ukraine ends up being.
My guess is the longer it takes the Ukrainian government to capitulate, the more Putin will take. And so this is a race thing. If the Ukrainians capitulate tomorrow, they keep Kiev. If they capitulate next Tuesday, they lose Kiev. I mean, it's a guesstimation, but it'll be where the line is. I don't know. Only Putin knows where the line is. There will be a point where he says, right, you've taken too long, I'm going to take more. Yeah.
And this is to teach the West, like, we told you what we were going to do. It's been obvious for years.
So what do we learn from this then? I mean, the Russians have been signaling their intentions. We've willfully ignored them. The Russians now have declared a war and invaded a country. We've kind of pledged to stand for those fighting the Russians. From what I understand, it really puts us in a very awkward position because there is no real face-saving way out for us. I mean,
No,
we've
there
been
isn't.
focusing a lot on the face saving out for Putin,
No.
but there's no real face saving out for Brussels,
this is,
either
to me,
NATO or the EU, right?
This is, to me, the Western suicide.
Mm.
The suicide in this is the West looking credible strategically. Like it did it.
I'm going to partially disagree with you, David. I think outside the West, you're entirely right. I think inside the West, with the possible exception of America, I think we will be sold a narrative that it was a good war and the Ukrainians are heroic losers.
Hmm.
I think in America, that argument is going to sink like a lead balloon.
Mm-hmm.
I think in America, it's just going to be the next added bit to drain the swamp.
Well, and for them to become more and more insular and give up on the world, because they can agriculturally, they can in terms of energy, they can in terms of fertilizer. They've got more reasons now to wash their hands of most things.
And if you had to deal with the EU, I think you would. But we're forgetting. I would say about 70% of the problem stems from Washington. And the rest can be distributed between Moscow, Brussels, and London. And people forget London's a big part of this problem. Where we go in the long run, I hope it creates a moment where we purge our foreign ministries, we purge our defense ministries, we purge our universities, we hire a goddamn huge number of stone cold reptilian realists. I'd like a job, and we stop. Stop
Now we're back to
the
the conversations from 10 years.
Yeah.
And we used to talk about them in small wars, wondering what would break the system.
Yeah.
And the irony is, we're still in the world of small wars, because to plan to do anything, you've got to plan to the scale you want to work at. And there were so many decisions made about how much we would do. Now, the economic sanctions, again, I totally agree with you, Rhoderick. Russia will just keep chugging along, growing wheat, making fertilizer, and selling stuff at high prices, because at the end of the day, otherwise we will have the Arab Spring Part 2, we'll have mayhem in Africa over food, and we'll probably even have near collapse in Latin America without food and fertilizer.
I think we will have masses of regime change in Europe. I think we will have the end of Europe, the European Union.
Yeah, the end of the European Union, again, that's another thing we've been talking about for 10 years. And this is finally their moment to really look truly stupid, because it have been.
Yeah.
But
you look at no, you go ahead.
No, it's just not new for them to look truly stupid. So once again, if we're talking about the extent to which that the media will sell the single image in the West, who controls the single image? People like Macron and Scholz. The sanitized.
Scholz has proven himself that he's not fit to govern a country. The ones that really stand out are van der Leyen, who has looked like she's hysterical. She looks like she's going to rip her hair out if she doesn't get her own way. Mm-hmm. She looks so inadequate. And Scholz, going to Russia and saying the things he said in Russia, shockingly.
It was a Chamberlain moment. It was outstandingly bad.
He's a clown.
But also, the Germans think economically now. They've got a ton of money invested in Russia, and they're seeing that if Russia does just chug along, producing potash, weapons, and wheat, that doesn't benefit all the German investments that were meant to buy Russia over to be nice.
Yeah.
So this really has totaled Germany's understanding in its Kool-Aid drinking, we don't do violence mindset. So they have a rethink of monumental. What Macron thinks he gets as an economic globalist who believes in niceness is anyone's guess too.
My thinking, pardon me, with Macron is, so he's got a bad election which he's trying to rig. French elections are always rigged. We should be brutally honest. French, American, Italian elections, they're always rigged. British ones and German ones, not so much. And your ones, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind yet. But
we'll find out soon enough.
Well, all we know in Australia is that no one wins. It's just a question of who loses.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
well, you're all going to lose soon because some idiot decided you should have an electronic currency. that person should be fired, and fired repeatedly. I don't know.
Great advantage that we have the golden diamonds to replace it with when it goes wrong.
What was I going to say? There was a thing. There was a point.
What drugs?
Oh, there. So Macron is looking for the great statesman moment that he can stride the world and say, "Oh, look, I stopped a war."
And to make up being a mediocre banker with a brain the size of a peanut.
Yeah.
And why are people so unkind?
I mean, you have got to remember, the French military effectively said, "If you don't sort France out, we'll sort you out."
That's why they got from the Sahel. They're getting ready for business.
And he's got three really good French center-right to, in inverted commas, far-right candidates, each of whom I think after the last week could probably beat him in an election, but he's trying to keep them out of the elections full stop.
Yeah.
And if either one of those,
he tried the trip to Lebanon to look nice. Now he had to try the trip to Russia to look credible. Nice didn't work, and credible isn't working any better.
I think I have images of Chirac going to Algeria and being cheered in the streets. And what possessed him to think he was going to get anything like that?
Yeah, but it was like Camus going back and talking about the middle position. It's okay.
Yeah, it's the other thing I think we need to do as a West is look at anybody who's tainted by World Economic Forum Association, because whether they're the great conspiracy or not, they produce wildly inadequate and unprofessional political classes.
Look, it's another form of drinking the Kool-Aid. The global economy will make us all nice, and we'll all sing Kumbaya while we trade goods that we've made fairly and without doing each other over. Is that?
I think the blood-curdling, hardcore political parties of the West, like the Tory party in England, maybe like your Liberal Party, I don't know.
No,
they need to start looking at the. I don't know. I've never been able to twig this with you guys watching whether there is a cold-hearted, realist inner body to the Liberal Party.
Talking about our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. You are. And he came up just the other day saying that we've got the axis of autocracies that we're having to deal with. That shows a degree of hardness and reptilian logic.
No, it's the arc of autocracy to replace the arc of instability, because the arc of instability is still unstable, so he doesn't like talking about it anymore. To jump back to when you were here, though, what we always used to say to you, that the problem was here, that even when it's bad, it's good, which is why the Liberal Party aren't hard at their heart, because they don't need to be.
Well, they might soon. Because I think Taiwan is going to happen. My guesstimation is Taiwan's going to happen the week before the Americans go to the polls.
Oh, for the midterms.
Oh, there's a scoop for us. All right.
Look, it's a guess. If I were the Chinese and I really wanted to get 2 years of being able to do what I wanted. I would want to have an America that was really ripping it up. And I think they may not need to, because they may get the poll results they want anyway. It really depends on the Senate. The Republicans will win, and they won't just be centrist, party of K Street Republicans. They're going to be Trump. Every sort of weird and wonderful burn down the swamp, which is a bit hard because it's wet.
Man, that's when you go to thermobaric.
Dry out the swamp, I say. Rhoderick, I have to say, thank you very much for being on Strategikon. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been way too long between drinks. The other thing is, poor Michael over here has been running around with a camera, and his arm must be getting very sore, and you must be getting very sleepy. So I'm going to say I'm going to wrap up, because you need to go and get some rest, and hopefully we'll be able to catch up in the not too distant future, where we can continue this conversation. I'm very curious about what your thoughts are on China.
Ooh. Next time I'm going to put a clock here so you can tell how late it is or early it is.
Yes, no, I can imagine it. Because close to 2, 3 in the morning now?
2 in the morning, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was great. I have missed having adult conversation. Pity it had to.
Adults.
I know. We're privileged.
The prelude to the end of the world had to bring it back.
Yep.
Maybe that could be the title for this podcast episode. We'll wait and see. Okay, well, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to our special guest, Rhoderick Miller, for being on Strategikon. My thanks to co-host David Olney and to producer Michael Magali and his very sore arm. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through Strategikon on the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel when available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, it's goodbye from me and
Goodbye from me.
And
goodbye from me.
there you go. Out of camera shot, but always with us. Thanks very much, everyone. Catch you on the next side.